Hello, I hope you're doing well and that you read some good things in the month of April. If you want to let me know in the comments below about some books that you've been immersed in recently, I'd be really glad to hear about that because it's just always really interesting to hear about what everybody has been reading. So last month I read quite a lot, and so I want to just have a casual chat about some things that really stand out to me about these books and things that I've found really memorable and I think that are going to stick with me over time. So I read 10 books in total. Mostly I've been book prize reading, alternating between the International Booker Prize and the Women's Prize for Fiction, but I have read a couple of other books as well. So I want to talk about those first because I've not discussed them in a video yet. So first off, there is Nevada by Imogen Binnie. So this novel was first published in 2013 and it was reprinted last year as a kind of cult trans classic. It has fans from authors like Tori Peters and Andrea Lawler and Brontes Purnell, who are all authors. I've really enjoyed their books in their past, so trust their opinion, and I'm really glad I did because this novel is so fascinating, and I instantly connected with it because its main protagonist, Maria, she is a big reader. She works in a bookshop, so kind of connect with her for those reasons, but she's not really the best employee. That's putting it nicely. She's not very dedicated to her job, and this just suddenly made me think back to when I was, I think, around 19 years old and living in Boston, and I got a part-time job in a bookstore kind of leading up until September time when college was starting and they needed more staff. And I feel like my training was quite bad and or not very well handled, and so I was frequently confused about how to actually assist customers, but then also I wasn't very proactive as an employee. Like you would think working in a bookshop would be sort of the ideal thing, but yeah, I just wasn't all that good about in it in the short time that I was working in this bookshop. And Maria in this novel, she has been at this bookshop in New York City for a number of years, and she's learned ways to do kind of the minimum amount of work as possible. She spends a lot of time just kind of lingering in the back of the bookshop or in the shelves that not many customers go to. Every once in a while she'll nip out and get a bagel and so yeah, she's not very dedicated to this job. Her only real passions are a blog that she keeps and also riding her bicycle through the city. She's not even that strongly connected with her girlfriend anymore. There's a lot of tension in their relationship, and her girlfriend feels that Maria is emotionally distant from her. And so we know right away in the very first chapter that Maria is not able to connect with her partner anymore sexually or emotionally. She has a real difficult time processing her own emotions, but she does have very strong views, especially about trans issues, which she talks about at length, and which is really interesting and really eye-opening. And so I feel like it's just this wonderfully frank account looking at her past and her life and sort of why she can't really progress on in her life. The novel is kind of billed, or I've seen it billed in some places, as a kind of road trip novel, which I feel like is slightly misleading in that when it finally does get to a road trip, so she sort of gets to this kind of crisis point, both in her employment and in her relationship, and so she spontaneously decides to just hit the road and borrow her girlfriend's car to go on this trip directly across the country. But immediately when she starts doing that, we don't see her again until she's on the other side, and when she meets another character there. So late on in the novel, not late on, but in the second big part of the novel, we're introduced to a character named James, who's living in this small town, who's quite young, working at this job that he's not very dedicated to either, and with a girlfriend he's not very dedicated to either. And when Maria meets him, sort of sees in him a younger version of herself, and so wants to connect with him and assist him in his life, and how she goes about writing about this this relationship between these two strangers and their awkward conversations felt very realistic, and how both of them sort of wanted to have this meeting point to like learn and grow and help each other, but couldn't quite get there. And so it's really interesting how that plays out, and the novel ends in a really interesting way. I think a lot of people might see it as an unsatisfying ending, but actually I think it works really well, and so this was just a wonderful read in this kind of conversational style that a lot of it is quite humorous in this kind of knowing way, but it's a lot of it is this kind of like tragic comedy, balancing this line as this woman doesn't really know how to progress on with her life, and a lot of that is wrapped up in her trans identity, and this gave me such a different view of the life of a trans woman than I've ever read about before. So I found it absolutely fascinating, but also really enjoyable to read. And I don't have a copy of this novel to physically show on camera at the moment because my husband has borrowed it. He's reading it in the hopes of joining my book club, because we're going to be discussing it in a few days' time. Now, I also did my thing this month of trying to read a short story every morning. I didn't do it every single morning because sometimes there were other books I was reading that I was really wrapped up in and wanted to continue on with. But there were a number of mornings when I read a short story from this collection called The Consequences by Manuel Munoz. And this is a really fascinating and beautifully, like really artfully written collection where I feel like the stories are these kind of slice of life type stories, very realistic, really immersing you in the whole world and perspective of certain characters. And how he does this is, I think, deceptively simple because it completely opens up their lives and makes you see their perspective in such a strong way, even though he doesn't always describe their emotional state in a very like overt way, but you can glean from a lot of the details of both their actions and the environment around them, how he describes that. It just evokes the world of these characters in a very striking way. So a lot of these stories are set in the southwest of America. Many of them involve characters that either have a Latin American background or heritage. Some of the characters are gay as well. In some of the different stories, he looks at some different gay relationships and gives a really new view, I think, to sort of gay life and kind of the tensions that can form in these different relationships. And I found it really beautiful. Many of the characters are also migrants and finding temporary work on farms. So obviously there's very little job security for them, and we see what happens to them when things go wrong or when they don't get the support that they need from their family or their community. And I was drawn to reading this book because it recently won the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Yes, there is a prize named after Joyce Carol Oates. She didn't start it herself. I think it's another organization that just kind of named it after her, but she is involved in it and reads a lot of the entries, and I think she's going to be doing this online conversation with Manuel Munoz at some point in the next few weeks. So I'll be eager to listen to that. And I absolutely love what the Irish author Colin Barrett says about this book. And if you've never read Colin Barrett before, he's a brilliant short story writer. I think he has his first novel finally coming out next year, which is really, really exciting. But yeah, he he describes this book in such an excellent way, where he says, Manuel Munoz's stories are melancholy, assured, and unforgettable. Like a porch light at midnight, they strike a circle of stark, dreamlike clarity around their characters, even as the darkness gathers in. That is such an elegant and excellent way of describing this fiction, and I completely agree with it. Now, something really interesting in alternating between the Women's Prize and the International Booker is that sometimes I'll find commonalities between books nominated for these different prizes, and I mean that happens within the prize as well, but especially one week when I just happened to be reading these two books right after each other, and I feel like these titles have a lot of similarities in that the stories and what happens in them is quite wacky and offbeat. They have this kind of comedic sense to them, but also have these serious issues going underneath what's happening in the stories. So I'm going to talk about them both individually. One of them worked better for me than the other one. So there's A System So Magnificent It Is Blinding by Amanda Svensson. And this story follows the lives of three triplets when they're all adults and living in very different parts of the world from each other. And at first I found this book and story like quite disarming, because the way she writes about these scenes, she'll get really in depth into what is happening in a moment, kind of highlighting these quirky details, and then suddenly she'll just drop in a bit of the plot that is really significant, but doesn't explain it right away. So I found that quite jarring at first, and it took me a while to ease into the stories. But then I did get more into the tales of the different siblings and how they have very different approaches to their lives. And there's a lot of characters in this who sort of see the world in a slightly different way. So one of the sisters, she has manic episodes. Another one is really gripped by fear, and then the brother of this trio of triplets, he's a doctor, and some of his patients, there's one of his patients who increasingly can only see the world in two dimensions, so that obviously creates a lot of difficulty for her in physically navigating the space around her. And then he also has a colleague who doesn't really believe that she has a soul, and has this very different way of relating socially to other people. So I feel like the novel highlights a number of individuals in this way who don't have this like uncommon experience of the world, and so a lot of the structure of the world that we take for granted, they view in a very different way. So I feel like the way she is writing about these characters, who are all quite idiosyncratic, is saying something larger than just their individual stories, and that's part of the whole overall meaning of the book. And as we are following each sibling, I did mostly enjoy each of their stories, but then especially later on in the book, and this is quite a long novel, it's like 500 something pages, 525 pages or so. How their stories come together felt a bit forced to me and increasingly unrealistic. And I know there's a slight comic tone to this story in that this isn't reality as it's portrayed in a very straightforward way, but at the same time I felt like if I wanted to be emotionally invested in their stories, I had to kind of believe what was happening, and it felt more just like the author was sort of playing and making jokes with the story rather than trying to recreate this or trying to create this situation in a way that I could really invest in and get something from. So but that's just me. Maybe it didn't really entirely work for me. I especially got frustrated with the sister that goes to Easter Island, and initially I was really interested in her story and reading about this landscape, which I've never been to and probably never will go to, but got really irritated with her section in that there were a couple of characters that really attached themselves to her in a way which I found really inexplicable, because she's not a very charismatic person. She's usually like quite hostile, so I don't really understand why these characters would suddenly like latch onto her in this way, which didn't really make sense. And so yeah, I was more interested in the other siblings' stories, but even those, I was just sort of reading along, and I was mostly enjoying it. I never really laughed out loud, but I felt like there were some things about the story which are just so weird that are just sort of like smiling and puzzling at. But yeah, as a whole, I was never entirely compelled by this book. I wasn't gripped by it in a way that I wanted to keep going back and finishing it. It was like a bit of a slog to get through, and like I said, by the end, I found it really disappointing in the way that it all comes together. Then there is The Dog of the North by Elizabeth McKenzie, and the central character in this, Penny, and a lot of the people she meets in the story are also quite offbeat and idiosyncratic. They're quite odd individuals, and the story begins with Penny at a very difficult place in her life, in that her relationship is broken up, she's lost her job, she doesn't have anywhere to live, but she hears that her grandmother is in trouble, that adult social services might be stepping into her grandmother's life because some people that came to the house were threatened by something that seems like a weapon that her grandmother was wielding. Her grandmother's a very difficult person to get along with, and so she goes there to try to assist her grandmother in cleaning out her house, because her grandmother's a bit of a hoarder, and there are some things which are found when they start clearing it out, which are quite sinister and worrying, and so you follow that, but she's led on this journey where she meets all these individuals that are also in a kind of crisis point, and she's kind of stumbling along, trying to keep up and trying to help them in different ways, in a way which is denying her own emotional and increasingly physical needs, and I found that quite powerful over the course of the story, in that you see how in her endeavor to help other people, she's really avoiding helping herself and the issues in her life which she's not reconciling with. And so I did enjoy this story quite a lot. Also, in this novel, like Nevada, it's kind of advertised almost as a road trip novel, whereas you don't actually get all that much road trip in this story. It's only I mean, she does travel around a fair amount, but the actual like road trip section only happens very later in the book. So if you're looking for just specifically a road trip novel, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book. And I know a lot of people were quite disappointed by this novel since it was listed for the Women's Prize for Fiction. But I found it really enjoyable and quite a relief. I think especially after a lot of much more heavy reading that I've been doing recently. So I was glad to read these two books in that way, that they weren't as immediately as serious as some of the other books that I've been reading this month. But I just felt this novel had a lot more charm to it, and I just sort of went with it after a while, just sort of curious to see where it was going to go and what the answers to a number of questions were. So definitely not my favorite book that I've read in recent months, but I enjoyed it overall. And there is Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin, which should have been shortlisted for the Women's Prize, I feel, but unfortunately didn't make it. And I know a lot of other people feel that way as well, because I found this novel to be so powerful in telling the story of Vietnamese family that are migrating out of the country after wartime. Some of them survive, some of them do not. So following their harrowing journey as the surviving members of this family try to build a new life for themselves in Great Britain, and how we follow one of the sons who died in the afterlife. And I feel like a lot is made about that section of the story, but really those are only two narrative bits to the story. We also get these more historically informed bits. There's a bit about Margaret Thatcher and her political policies in the times in terms of immigration, and about some U.S. Military practices and following that, but also like the lives of tourists that travel to these areas that migrants have passed through in years gone by. But there's also a narrative section by an author figure who eventually is revealed to be a character in the story, but an author that is trying to frame this story, this migrant story, which has been told in a number of different fictions, but this novel gives a really new view on it and is so beautifully balanced to give this rounded perspective of events and this issue, but also tell this really personal story where by the end of it, I was completely emotionally invested in the lives of these individuals and this family, and I thought that was so artfully done. It's really, this novel, though it's a debut, it's really informed by a lot of different literature, and the way it is informed in that way, I feel like is really elegantly integrated into the structure of it. So I feel like it could be easy to, in reading this, because there are so many different parts to it, to that it might kind of pass you by the more profound meaning of it. But I took my time with this story and let it settle over me, and I found it really strong. And I'm sure if I went back and reread it, I would get even more out of it. But I know this book didn't entirely work for everyone, and it could be just that we all have different ways of reading books, and so it just. It might not have been as effective for everyone, but personally, I found it to be incredibly moving and powerful. The novel Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow, which is a family saga that moves backwards and forwards in time. I'm looking at different generations of women in this family. So it begins with a family tree, and I love a novel that has a family tree in the beginning, just because I love looking at how different generations play out over time, and so you can see like the heritage, and but I also find this practically useful to flip back to when I'm initially just starting to get to know the characters and figuring out how they are situated alongside each other, especially because the story jumps backwards in times and go forwards in time and then goes backwards in time again. It might feel slightly a bit disorientating at first, but I did find it quite easy to follow, and it all made sense in the end, especially why it was structured that way in kind of moving around time like this. It's saying something about the way that trauma can be inherited throughout generations, and the way stories are passed down between different generations. And so I found this story quite moving and impactful, how it shows different instances of racism, and how the characters navigate this in this part of the United United States, and how this impacts their family over time in regards to the individual members of this family and their ambition, and the battle between sexes, and so there is some domestic abuse in this. There is child abuse, and it's shown in this story how really these things are influenced in part by larger issues that are going on and affecting the individuals in this community and this family. But the descriptive powers in this story and their connection to each other, their love for one another, but also their love of their environment, the community around them, and the food that they cook and share. And I just loved how all of that was evoked in this story, and how the larger complex issues just kind of subtly build up in the back of your mind as you're following the immediate events of these different women's lives. There are also a number of International Booker Prize books I've read, which I've made individual videos about, but so I'll just cover them briefly. But I do really want to highlight Boulder by Eva Baltasar, because this novel, even though it is so short, it's really stuck with me. The poetic power of this story and the issue it raises of an individual who is so self-sufficient, but then the difficulty she finds when connecting with a partner, and when that partner wants to have a child, and following that story. And I've had so many interesting conversations about this novel with other readers who've experienced it, and some of whom have very different takes on it. And I feel like looking at this story, like it can be easy to say that, to have the perspective that, oh, she's just not maturing enough, that that eventually everyone does like settle down in a relationship and has a family life, or maybe she's not opening herself up to the benefits and the value that come from having these domestic arrangements, and with having a child, and like interacting with the child. Like I know from I don't have any children myself, but I have nephews. I have a godson. I have lots of friends who have children that I've known ever since those children were born. So I know the great value that can come from interacting with children. It can be so inspiring and funny and exciting to see children develop and grow and acquire their own personality over time. That is so fascinating to see, and how that relationship builds over time. But obviously they're not my own children, so I get this sort of once removed. And I know, and my husband have like agreed that we never really want to have children. That's just not something that we aspire to in our lives, and so that's just our individual decision. But I know how difficult it would be if one or the other of us did really want children and the other one didn't. And so I feel like you could view that she just isn't opening herself up to this possibility. But I think it's more that her character just really knows herself and knows that she really enjoys having a rootless existence. She really enjoys not having these emotional attachments which bog her down in one place, and knows that if she stayed in this domestic situation and continued raising this child full time, that it would really negatively impact her personally, and probably negatively impacts the people around her. And we basically follow as that starts happening, and then she decides to separate from her partner. And sorry, that's a bit of a spoiler, but it's such a short book. I feel like you can't really spoil it, because the issues in it are the main thing. And it's really moving how she continues to be a part of her child's life and still sees her part-time, but knows that this sort of part-time parenting is really all that she wants in her life and can emotionally and psychologically handle in her life. So for her, it's really the right thing to do. And and I'm sure we all know of couples that have stayed together and longer than they should have, or might have had a child in a kind of attempt to keep their relationship together, which never really works, and inevitably creates a really sad situation. And so my interpretation of this story is that she kind of makes the right choice. But I know a lot of other readers have different feelings about this, and I'd be really interested to continue to discuss this book with you if you have a different point of view of it, or don't entirely agree with me. So it was quite interesting reading Is Mother Dead by Vigdis Hjorth, especially after reading Boulder, because in some ways this is looking at issues to do with parents and children from the other side of the equation, in that we follow the life of a woman who has been separated from her family in Norway for a really long time, has had only very loose connections, just kind of very sparse messages with her sister about very essential things, and it's broken down to the point where they don't communicate at all anymore. And now that she's moves back to Norway, reaching out to her mother, that's completely rejected, and her messages to her go unanswered, and so it's looking at this family life that is just completely fractured and isn't able to be repaired, because these two different factions have such different ways of living in the world. And I feel like her parents and her sister sort of felt like you have to do what's sort of best for the family and what society expects of you, whereas the narrator of the story decided that wasn't for her. So early on in her life, she was stuck in a marriage and working towards a profession which she really didn't feel passionate about, so decided to leave those things, and then her family broke off from her. Now, we only get her perspective in this story, so I'm sure her mother and her sister, and also the narrator's son, would have a very different viewpoint of the family life and events surrounding the breakdown. So in some ways, I feel like you're supposed to question, like, can you entirely believe and trust her? But I feel like overall she is quite trustworthy and sympathetic. So my interpretation of the story, I sort of took it at face value, and I feel like the messages you get from the sister, the reasons why her family choose not to communicate with her, are the reasons which the sister gives. I mean, there might be other hidden reasons, but the main reasons seem to be about breaking from her husband and her profession, but also creating art, which the family have chosen to take personally. So feel like it's a source of embarrassment, whereas she feels like her art isn't necessarily straightforward or autobiographical in that way. It's meant to be more symbolic, obviously, because it is visual art. So it's really interesting seeing these different points of view and how it plays out, and the tension of this story as she follows her mother, and it grows increasingly uncomfortable as she impedes upon her mother's life, and feel like like she should let it go, but she can't. And I feel like the unspoken emotional reasons for why she can't let it go really build up over the course of this story, which made it quite impactful overall. Now, Time Shelter is a novel which has continued to haunt me in a way, in that I've continued to think about a lot of the central issues of this story, and I expected and agree with it being shortlisted for the International Booker, and I think a lot of readers see it as probably front runner in this literary competition, but I'm not sure, because this story didn't feel entirely emotionally satisfying to me in following the characters, though the ideas in this story have really stuck with me. The characters really haven't, and I feel like, especially with this character who kind of moves in and out of the story and through different periods of time, and we're not even sure if he actually exists, and he probably doesn't, and is more a manifestation of the central character's like fictional idea of the world, and this creating this situation in order to explore these deeper ideas to do with nostalgia and memory and history, and how that impacts our ideologies and the ways we interact with society, and the way countries are governed, and so all of that is really good. But I felt like we got so few pieces about this central character's story, about his life, just these like little nuggets of information, both from his past and his aspirations. There were some things which were shown to us, which were just kind of put out there and then left, and we didn't get the rest of the story. And I'm sure that was completely purposeful on the author's part, but it's meant that this book hasn't stayed with me in a way that a lot of these other books that I've talked about have, because their characters are so strong in my minds, and the dilemmas of a lot of the different characters in these different books just have really stuck with me, whereas I feel like there's no individual in this story that I feel like I can latch onto, and that I felt like was my guide. I felt like I was being led through a series of different concepts, which were really interesting in how it explores all these larger ideas. But yeah, it just and so it has stuck with me in a certain way, but not in the way that I personally enjoy when reading novels. You know, if this was a book of essays, or it was a nonfiction book, or kind of even, I mean, I guess you could say it's kind of like speculative fiction in a way, because it is looking at these countries that are holding referendums that they want to move to certain decades from the past, which doesn't literally happen, but has happened in a way in Brexit, and the way a lot of countries, how certain political leaders, and especially populist leaders, have tried to lead countries backwards in time, and how that is juxtaposed in the way he shows this, looking at past communist systems that whose ideologies were so focused on this bright future rather than the present. And it's almost this trap that political systems fall into when they're not concerned with the present and the needs and concerns of people in the present, but are looking backwards or forwards in time, and the troubles and issues that causes. And you know, obviously we have to be cognizant of both the past and the future, but yeah, when we completely ignore the present and what is happening in the present, we can see the disastrous things that can unfold in countries. And that's kind of, and looking at history, we see the fallout of that. And so, yeah, so many interesting issues, but then at the same time, yeah, like I said, just my emotional connection to this story doesn't feel quite as strong. So it's a really tricky and interesting one. I'd love to know what other people have made about this book, because it is so fascinating. And finally, there is Standing Heavy by GauZ, looking at the lives of a number of different Black men from Côte d'Ivoire who moved to Paris and become security guards there, also moving backwards and forwards in time, to show how the past, how that has impacted more recent years, and the aspirations of these different individuals who have moved to this country, who are hoping for upward social mobility, but because of events that occur politically, and also to do with racism and xenophobia, mean that a lot of the men who are portrayed in this are kind of stuck in these very tedious jobs, just working as security guards, standing there all day long, observing people around them, and how these different individuals either fall back into their imaginations, or kind of satirically looking at the situation around them, or making plans for the future and looking towards the future. It is quite poignant how this builds up over the course of the story. But again, I feel like though I got quite a lot of sense of certain characters' lives in this story. I feel like I never fully understood their story in like a larger context because we only get little bits and pieces of their lives. So again, this is a novel which isn't the kind of typical novel that I would really enjoy, but I thought it was really interesting how he juxtaposes the things in this book, going backwards and forwards in time and using these different kinds of perspectives to tell this story. And in the more present day, in the 2010s, following the guard whose name we don't even know, as he's making these observations about the people around him, some of which are quite satirical and funny, and some which are more social critiques of why this situation is the way it is, and just how absurd this kind of capitalist system is that he's a part of, and how it is really holding him down in his life and not allowing him to progress. But at the same time, there's a lot of uncomfortable observations he makes, which are also racist and xenophobic and sexist, as he's observing all of these people. And I feel like the darker edge of this story really comes from being locked in this system, which he can't entirely extricate himself from. So yeah, really interesting novel that is quite experimental in a way, but a very strong and powerful voice that gives an entirely new point of view. So really glad that I read this, and really glad I read all of these books, because so many interesting issues and stories that I found really enriching and exciting to talk about. So if you've read any of these books, I would love to know what you think about them in the comments below, and I'd be glad to discuss them with you. Or now, after hearing me talk about them, if you're interested in reading any of these books, I'd love to hear about that as well. But like I said, I'd also really enjoy hearing about what you've been reading recently, and whether it's good or bad. And yeah, it's just always fun hearing about what other people are reading. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things. We're steadily moving through prize season, so I do have more prize book reading to do before we find out the winners of these particular prizes I've been following most closely. In the next couple of months, the winners will be declared, so that will be really exciting. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.